Good morning, everyone. My name is Alia Azariah. I am Director of Aftercare for Safe House Project, and it's my privilege to get to host this webinar series every month for the last, I guess 3 years at this point. And the point of our webinar series has never been to provide comprehensive trainings. We know that each topic that we host a webinar on could be a 3-day or 6-week training course, but really to start conversation, to point you in the direction of other people who are maybe either seeking information on that or maybe have more information than what you currently have, and to really unite the field. One thing that we noticed when we started this webinar series was that a lot of people were encountering the same barriers, the same situation, the same needs across the country, but because doing direct care takes so much effort and so much work, that they didn't have time or resources to look outside themselves to know that everyone else was struggling with the same thing also. And that some people maybe were a few years ahead in their struggle and were able to find some solutions. So that's the point of our webinar series, to help bridge that gap in the national landscape and bring us all into the same highest level of care that we can provide to the survivors that we work with. And so this webinar I am very excited about because I think it's a topic that comes up often. So excited to have this webinar. It's something we've wanted to do for the last couple of years. I'm so excited that it kind of came to fruition. But one of the, as I'm sure everyone on this call probably knows, one of the biggest barriers that survivors face in healing is finding therapists. Like, I know I pay out of pocket to be able to find somebody that could understand and work with me in my level of trauma. I hear that sentiment across the board. We see that reflected in research. Polaris's Resilience Fund and the National Survivor Study that they put out both reflect that continuously. It's something that, we hear from clinicians, from survivors themselves, from direct care workers, that one of the biggest barriers is survivors finding appropriate therapy that is really beneficial to them. And so hoping to maybe shed some light on how we can continue to build that network. So whether you're a clinician who's wanting to work with this population, somebody who's wanting to train other clinicians, or maybe direct care workers or other organizations who partner with clinicians and want to know how to kind of prompt them to become equipped to work with this population. Really glad you're here, and excited that you get to learn from our panelists. So I'm very excited to get to introduce them today, except for I lost everybody's bios. I had them pulled up. Oh, here they are. Great. So I'm going to start introducing Jen. Jennifer Gabriel serves as the Clinical Counseling and Care Director at Forever Found, which is a local nonprofit here where I am in Ventura County, providing victim services to at-risk and CSEC youth. She's currently developing and leading the care strategy for their staff and volunteers, providing relational support, processing groups, and counseling. Inspired by her experience with Forever Found and working with CSEC youth for 10 years, she returned to school to earn an MA in clinical mental health counseling and a master's certificate in children at risk, and start her clinical practices, which focuses on somatic experiences and specializes in anxiety, grief, developmental trauma, and PTSD. So thanks, Jen, for being here. Emily Taylor Ginger at LCSW. She has over 10,000 hours spanning across 10 plus years in anti-trafficking commercial sexual exploitation work. She has specialized experience in advocacy, program development, medical social work, and mental health therapy. She founded a private practice, Collective Growth, where she focuses on mental health care for those who have experienced harm or violence in the commercial sex industry. And she provides training and consultation on sex trafficking, commercial sex, industry trauma, and mental health. She additionally is the impact producer of an incredible resource, Point of View Story, which we've highlighted in a previous webinar, where she clinically consults on the creation of therapeutic films. And she authors material for their therapeutic process. And then we also have Elizabeth Schultz, LPC. She is trained in EMDR, but she has extensive experience working with trafficked individuals. She's worked at a safe house for victims of trafficking, and there she saw firsthand the struggles these survivors faced in accessing necessary mental health care needed for, as we all know, it's needed for recovery to even be possible. So she realized that advocating and providing services to survivors with equal access to recovery through evidence-based mental health services and aftercare was her passion. She is the director of clinical services at Treasured Vessels Foundation, and was integral in developing an evidence-based clinical program there. And while she developed a phased model approach to mental health services, utilizing EMDR and integrating internal family systems, IFS theory, with a phased model. And so that has been very successful with the clients that she's worked with. And in January of this year, she launched her own private practice and consulting, where she continues to serve survivors through outpatient services. She also provides training, consultation, and expert witness testimony. So as you can see, awesome people to be able to work with and be able to learn from today. So thank you guys for joining and pulling time away from survivors and providing necessary care to them to help equip and teach other people as well. So we appreciate you being here. We're going to jump right in. So we talked a little bit about why this is important, but in your opinion, or through what you've seen, what are some of the biggest barriers that survivors of trafficking face when seeking mental health support?
I think one of the biggest barriers I've seen is really finding therapists who are adequately trained to work with this population. And I think we'll get into this in more detail as we carry on today, but really understanding that a trafficking experience has a culture to it, and really understanding the nuances of how that culture can look very different for each individual. But being trained in trauma is really wonderful, and having kind of tangential experiences certainly can inform the therapeutic approach, but really being adequately trained on trafficking and sexual exploitation is crucial for therapy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'll speak to what I've seen in residential, where cost is not the barrier. I know outpatient cost is a huge barrier for quality services, but within the residential space, I think it's helping the executive directors and other people that are part of the organization understanding the significance and impact of mental health and their own biases or experiences with previous clinicians. I think that has been a barrier. I've heard statements that, well, we've worked with therapists in the past and that's caused a lot of issues because therapists have not been appropriately and adequately trained. And so they actually did harm. And I've heard that from survivors sharing of their own experiences. And so then staff does a very much like, we need to teach skills, or not understanding developmental trauma and being able to look through that lens. And so they see behaviors as defiance or resistance or not readiness for change. And so clients then are dismissed from programs or treated in such a way that's not actually in line with the understanding that we have of developmental trauma.
Adding on to what Emily and Elizabeth are saying, I think that's what I was seeing so much of, providing direct services for youth and being in situations with them where they would share something, and I would, ask them if it's something that they had shared with their clinician, and was very often met with, I'm not telling that blankety blank blank anything. And it was provided a lot of curiosity for me on the safety that's not created, as well as what Elizabeth's saying as far as seeing so many different clinicians. So it's not uncommon before they're 18 to have 9 or 10 clinicians, and having a clinician maybe when they're in juvenile facilities, and then a clinician when they get out assigned. And so it's constantly re-traumatizing them with even sharing or telling a story to begin with, or beginning to get help and feel safe in a therapeutic environment.
Thank you. So if there is someone who's wanting to step in to fill that gap, right, as we're addressing that and hoping that 5 years from now is not a significant barrier, what specific training and education would you suggest that clinicians pursue to be better prepared to work with this population?
Yeah, I think we need to reconceptualize what the role of the clinician is with this population. There's some research that has started to lend to that, as saying that the scope of care of what these clients need is so extensive that it does push on the limits of what a traditional therapist scope of practice looks like. And so a lot of clinicians avoid it because there's a lot of ethical challenges that can present with this population. And so I think it's helping them to have a framework of what does it look like to create safety for therapy to actually happen. So more clinicians get into this space. And so that's really what I found that has helped me now in private practice, is having a grid for what does coordinated care look like. Because otherwise, as an individual clinician, I would not be safe to do that work because the burnout would be so high and my clients would not have the wraparound. And so that's where I think reconceptualizing what does the role of the therapist, like it's not in a like an isolated cylinder. They go to therapy and then they have case management. And so I think that's something a clinician needs to have a lens for.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think with that, also really considering offering therapy outside of insurance frameworks, because there are so many barriers and restrictions. And though sometimes that's the only way it can happen, and something is probably better than nothing. But thinking about, if your agency or organization is able to partner with grants or things like that, where you can pay a therapist through private pay, and maybe they're able to see a client for a 2-hour session instead of 45 minutes. Thinking kind of outside the box can really create an environment where folks feel more safe. And one kind of specific topic I think that's not talked about enough in this space is dissociation, and really equipping therapists on understanding dissociation and how that shows up in the therapeutic space and also outside of the therapeutic space.
Going a little more specific in some of those things. And I know, like, for instance, I know, Emily, you're trained in IFS, Elizabeth, you are as well, EMDR. What specific therapeutic approaches or therapeutic modalities have you found to be most effective when working with trafficking survivors? For one, I'm sure there's clinicians on here who are wondering what they should be supplementing their expertise, but then also for those who maybe contract with clinicians or hire clinicians to be looking at, okay, what should I be looking at in the people that I'm sending my survivors that I work with to?
Yeah, as you said, internal family systems or parts work is really effective in my experience. EMDR can be really great too. And I think being mindful of allowing yourself to be flexible as the therapist, where, even if you are an EMDR therapist and you love it and you want to do it all the time, allowing yourself to kind of take a step back and say, is this really what the client needs today? And allowing yourself to stray from some of those more rigid paths. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is another type of therapy that I utilize. And there's actually a newer training that's focused specifically on commercial sexual exploitation of children and coupling that with TFCBT. So you can look that up. And then creative types of therapy using art, using film therapy, like point of view story, incorporating those kinds of creative expressions can be really powerful with this population as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hold really strongly to a phase model approach. Those of you who are in the clinical space may have read Judith Herman's work on trauma and recovery. And she was really the first one that said, we need to start with safety and stability. And then Janina Fisher really kind of fleshed that out even further. And so what I found is for most of these survivors, they were not taught how to be safe and how to be stable. And what I've seen happen with clinicians, because we got to address this trauma, we got to do this, that we jump too quickly to the trauma work. And what we end up doing is we destabilize the client, or they come away, they stop going to therapy because they don't have the tools yet to cope with just the dysregulation. And so we have to go, where are they in the safety and stability continuum? So that's one of the first things that I start with, and it starts by assessing. So I really think that we want to assess, build a good rapport, and provide psychoeducation as to the why. I have had clients that they're hesitant to even do therapy because they're so afraid of being forced to talk about what happened. And when you provide the education of, no, that's actually not what's going to serve you best. I want to start with, how are you functioning now? And can we help you function better? And that's the buy-in. And that's, most clients are like, yeah, I don't want to have panic attacks. I don't want to be overwhelmed by flashbacks. And then as you build the rapport, then we start to bring in the CBT skills. Then we start to bring in IFS and EMDR, and they start to see the gains. So it's a very intentional, structured approach that I find to be really helpful, that takes some of the ambiguity out of therapy, but also gives you a grid as a clinician. If I start with safety and stability, I know where I'm starting. And if things get wonky, I know where I'm always going back to. So that, I don't think we do enough to equip people with that kind of lens. So regardless of their modalities, they kind of know where they need to be on that train.
Yeah, I love that, because I think what I hear from outside clinicians when we've talked to them about possibly getting involved with this population, or is that it feels very overwhelming, that they don't know where to start, that they don't understand enough. And so that model of hey, we're focusing on safety and stability first, can you focus on that? It seems like something that people could go, okay, if I know that that's my primary goal, this feels less intimidating to work with the population. Jen, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to add to that, I completely agree with the rapport and the safety building to begin with as well. There's so much hesitancy in coming into the room to begin with. I also use IFS and I'm EMDR trained, but if speaking to what Emily said, is just being willing to look at where your client is at the moment. They might come in with what happened. Again, I work with youth mainly, what happened at school, or a friend issue, or this or that. And so even though as a clinician, I might be looking at it thinking oh, well, this is what we're going to do today, or we're going to, I thought we were going to do EMDR today or something. It's just, we rewrite it to whatever they need at the time, or whatever regulation they need at the time. I spend a lot of time, I have a client who loves Legos. So we just look for, and the satisfaction she gets when they click. And we talk about that and the frustration when something doesn't work out. So just using everyday things to build and use those as starting points to talk about and work through some of the things that they're working through. So, and realizing, I feel a lot of the clients are not even feeling, whether it's good feelings or bad feelings, they're so numb. And so just providing a space to even notice what a good experience looks like, and holding some space for that feels really important, especially in the beginning.
Yeah. And Emily, I know when we spoke prior to this webinar in preparation, this was something that you had really wanted to touch on. Kind of what are the differences, or what are some of the key considerations that people stepping into this space need to have in mind when they're thinking, when they're providing clinical care to trafficking survivors versus maybe some of the intersecting populations or intersecting experiences, such as domestic violence, homelessness, sexual assault?
Yeah. Yeah, I think to me, equipping therapists well as they're considering working with this population is helping them understand the culture of trafficking, and understanding that this is often a system of violence that can really differ from isolated experiences of sexual harm or domestic violence, where maybe there is one identified partner or a few, but we're talking about often a system of folks who are collaborating to cause harm, that spans across traffickers, folks who report to the traffickers, buyers and experiences with them, potentially other folks that a victim may be also working in the life with. And so really understanding the terminology, understanding how these different experiences can show up within that broader system. And in a lot of ways, from what I have experienced, there can be a lot of overlap with thinking about kind of like cultural, like religious or cult abuse, where it really can be this secluded environment at times. And everyone's experience is different. So we have to keep that in mind too. But I think really recognizing that there are often many, many people at play within these experiences of harm, and understanding that individual's experience is so crucial.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to add to what Emily just said. I think it's really important to understand the system that these clients are coming out of. And within that, there's often early trauma prior to the trafficking. As part of these systems they can be a part of. You know, it could be a family member that is connected with a pimp or a trafficker. And so the vulnerabilities of the abuse and the dysfunction in the family. So we have to think about the trauma that they experience, the trauma of trafficking, and then the trauma that happens in the context of trafficking. So there's these compounding effects that we have to be aware of, and that takes place within a system. So Emily's point is really important for us to learn about what that looks like, and to learn the language and what that looks like in our clients, because they might not even recognize it as exploitation. But if we're educated, then we can invite curiosity as they're ready to look at it, because our clients may not have put the dots together and they may not be ready to. And like, we have to be okay with that. And then one of the things that I wanted to highlight too is dissociation as well is, I think, not as understood, especially by service providers outside of the clinical, but even within the clinical, how nuanced, how subtle it is. And the research is just now starting to really help language that. There's a great article by Georgia State. They said that the dissociation seen in victims of trafficking differs than if there was just sexual assault or sexual abuse in childhood, because of all the layers and systems. And that creates greater symptomology and greater functional impairment. So we have to be aware of the role dissociation plays in the pervasive and perniciousness of the symptoms that keep people stuck in the life, in those cycles.
That's really interesting. I would love to see that.
Yeah, I can see the article later on. Yeah. And
I
share
would love to see
yeah.
it.
Yeah.
That would be great. I can even, if other people if attendees are interested, I can attach it to send it out as well, because that is, yeah, I would love to see that information.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to add on to this? Anything else to add?
Can I say one more quick piece?
Yes,
I think
please.
to piggyback on Elizabeth's comments about dissociation too, I think that element of dissociation and kind of role transition as an individual, maybe meeting up with a buyer, how they show up in that space, how they show up across the spectrum of buyers, then how they're showing up with their trafficker, how they, if they aren't secluded, how they're showing up maybe with their family or with their other friends who don't know this is happening. And that intense frequency of constantly changing how they show up creates an environment where dissociation is so prevalent, and oftentimes a sense of, I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what my identity is.
Yep. Absolutely. Jen, do you have anything you want to add?
No, that's perfect.
Okay. Yeah, that was very powerful. Thank you.
Mhm.
And when talking about some of these key things, key differences, right? I want to touch on trauma bonds or trauma coerced attachment. and how that affects the therapeutic process for survivors.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a critical part of many folks' experience of an intense bond and connection with someone who also caused harm. And something that I often talk with clients about, and I have found it to resonate with them, is really kind of dissecting the emotion of love and how we feel that as an emotion in our body, and it might feel euphoric and connective, and behaviors that are loving. And oftentimes I see kind of a light bulb click when we can dissect those and say, hey, I really do feel love for this person. And also they have treated me with unloving behaviors. And that can help folks really see that those both can exist at the same time. We don't have to say they're all bad all the time, nothing's good about it, but we can hold space to allow those emotions of love and connection for someone who may have also caused really severe harm to them.
Yeah. I think this is where IFS can be really beautiful in helping clients to recognize. I had a client that had so much internal distress because of this conflict, and being able then to voice, because there was so much shame that she felt around this feeling good or wanting the connection and the feeling of care from this person, but also then these other parts of self that were like, but I hated this harm and I don't want to be hurt. And that huge, like, but this part wants that piece again, but it means this might happen again. And that internal wrestling, and being able to sit with them and get curious and create a safe space where there's the shame can kind of be lifted and go, yeah, that makes a lot of sense that you would want that nurture. We all want to be, and really validate the need to be cared for, the need, like that's a valid need. And being able to help that part see that as not a desire to be abused, but as a desire to have connection.
Yeah.
And before that coercion, there are a lot of times there were so many vulnerabilities that were created prior to that, that love could be mixed up to begin with. So again, taking that space for it. And I know we talked a little bit about this before, but it feels like a great spot to point in that it's so important for the clinicians to have training in trafficking, and more than an hour of training in trafficking to understand what coercion looks like, because I think that was surprising to me in meeting and starting to communicate with other clinicians and realizing they don't understand the piece of coercion. Really, they don't see how that's affected the in my case, the youth, right? It's affected the victims and the survivors. And so there's this, can even with therapists be a push to push through something where there needs to be the space and the time to go through and process what has happened. So that education piece is so important for us as clinicians as well, to be able to really understand what's happening and it has happened to survivors.
Yeah. And Emily, you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about this being a consideration, but how important is cultural competence when you're providing therapy? I mean, just in general, but especially to trafficking survivors, and what steps can clinicians take to ensure that they're being culturally humble and sensitive?
I'm so passionate about this topic. Yeah, I mean, I think it really is so important because so much of the therapeutic space is hearing about the client's experience, hearing where they're at. And if we don't have an understanding on, how familial trafficking might really differ from gang facilitated trafficking or partner controlled trafficking, we can really find ourselves missing a lot of pieces as they're sharing information. And it can also create some rupture at times if we're, constantly asking, okay, what does this term mean? What do you mean when you say the game or the life? And it's not that we have to know every term and know everything about, how these experiences differ, because the reality is different parts of the country, different parts of the world use different terms. So we can have grace for ourselves there, but having some idea of what they're talking about can really give a sense of connection, like, hey, you get me, or at least you understand some of these things. It's not like I'm talking to, my teacher or my, so-and-so who has no idea what I've been through. We want to create a space where they can at least have some connection there.
Yeah. I think authenticity is really important in that. And what I mean is not trying to take on a role in order that we could be acceptable to the client. I think when we go, this is my like lived experience, this is my lens, and that doesn't make me better. That's like, I can't change that I'm white. I can't change that I was the good girl growing up, and that I kind of, without trying, present pretty squeaky clean. And when I have clients that has not been their narrative, it can be really easy when I'm working with youth to want to try to be cool, right? If I'm not connected to like, this is who I am, to being able to accept me and accept them and how they show up. That's where it allows a safe space for those differences and curiosity that doesn't seem like, oh, you tell me this knowledge and now I can be cooler because I know this slang. But it's really like, no, like, this is my lens. And because of that, it's going to be limited. I want to hear, like, what is your lens? And I found it really helpful just to own especially when I've done group and I've got the girls coming in and they're like, getting into their music and they're talking and goofing. I'm not going to try to be someone I'm not. And just to own, like, I'm a white goody two shoes. And I found that just kind of takes some of that out of who do you think you are, trying to tell us, like, you haven't had our experiences. And I'm, no, I haven't. So I think that humility, that authenticity, and allowing clients to like show up and feel accepted, that unconditional regard, that they are welcomed and cared for in however they show up in whatever way.
Yeah. I agree. I've had similar experiences to what Elizabeth is saying in regards to working with groups and being in that room where again, I'm not, as she said, I'm a white middle-aged woman, right? And so how does that relate? And it is what it is there, and not pretending that it's something else. And at times it's created laughter, and that's actually created a relationship too, and transparency in those situations. So I think there's a piece of embracing that and creating the comfort that we can in it for each other, and know that the reason that we're there, that it is because of a caring spirit to begin with.
Yeah, and what I'm really hearing from everything that you guys are describing goes right back to that safety piece, right? Like, how are we providing a space where you're allowed to be who you are, which is one of the safest things that we can provide to someone, right? Where you're not having to put up some kind of front, you're able to show up as you are, and you're able to know that, like, this person is going to understand me, or at least attempt to understand me, or allow me to be all of those things. And I think that's, especially important when we take into consideration that this crime, this type of victimization, disproportionately affects people of color. And, people who have master's degree and clinical degrees will be disproportionately people of privilege. And so we're going to have to learn how to cross that divide until hopefully we have more and more people of color who are able to step into these clinical positions. And so a really, really key consideration as we're providing this kind of care to this specific population as well. And I see people continue to like raise their hands. Just for those who are new, we don't have time usually to unmute people. And so if you have a question, the best way to get that to us is to put it in the Q&A section here that allows us to kind of streamline the questions so that we have time to get to all of them. Elizabeth, you kind of touched on these ethical considerations towards the beginning of the webinar. What are some of those key ethical considerations clinicians need to be aware of when working with survivors?
Couple of different ones. I think the first one that comes to mind is informed consent. If we're working with an agency, helping the client understand what is shared and what is not shared, I think is really important as part of the informed consent. How you're going to communicate with their advocate. If you are a clinician that has an agency that's referred, I have a form that I go through with the survivor that talks about what is coordinated care and what it's not, what I share and what I don't share. That helps them know that if they're suicidal, this is how I'm going to communicate it. This is what I'm going to share. And then also with that is letting them know about their rights to not disclose something. And I think that's important because they need to know that if they disclose something, I have ethical requirements to make reports. And so letting them know they can make the choice not to disclose something and telling them that ahead of time.
We use similar practices with the informed consent as well, and being really clear on some of those areas. We work wrap around with some other agencies as well. So all of that is defined right from the beginning, so they know. So it's kind of out on the table, and hearing what they want within that as well. So just because we work with another agency doesn't mean that they're giving permission for me to talk to the case manager at another agency about their case, even if that's who referred them. So really starting with giving them choice to begin with who they want to me to share with or not to share with, and at what level.
I think being really open about what the informed consent entails and giving them options, allowing them to know what their options are, because sometimes, folks have been in experiences or environments where maybe they didn't have a lot of options, or if they did what they thought the other person didn't want them to do, then things went really, really wrong. And so being really overt about hey, you don't have to sign this. You get to decide if you want to be part of this, and you can revoke your informed consent at any time. So if you decide, outside of court mandated things, if you decide that you don't want to be part of this anymore, these are your options. This is what you can do. And just kind of letting them know what those things are.
Yeah, absolutely. This isn't a question that we had on the outline, but I know that some of you can answer this. I know we're going to get questions around okay, where do I go? Or where do I point people to become more equipped? And I know for instance, and I know Emily, you've had history with them, and I pointed Jen to them earlier this year, Ascent 121 has their Build Beyond conference that's specific to clinicians. Elizabeth, you have your consulting that's specific to this. Do you all have any other suggestions of where people should look if they're wanting to become more equipped to work with this population?
I think networking and webinars, that's what really helped me, was through the personal relationships. That's how I got to know Emily and get connected. And she'll share about something oh, great, will you send me that resource or tell me more about that? And those are those type of relationships that I think help us to create a competent clinician field, because we share from one another, we lend of our experiences. So I'd say get on these opportunities. Point of View Story has beautiful networking gathering spaces for that. They facilitate that. That's a great way to develop insight, connection, competency, and then be a reader. I think that's helped me a lot, is learning about developmental trauma, learning and connecting and building my network of people that are in this space. I think that's how I've learned was, just pursuing those things.
Yeah.
I think also learning directly from folks with lived experience, whether that's books possibly that folks have published or their own webinars or trainings or things they've shared on YouTube or videos that are available, but just learning directly from folks and their experiences can be really helpful. And then as a clinician, even kind of thinking about, okay, if this person walked into my office, what are some things that I would think about in working with them, and just kind of getting your mind geared towards that, those types of stories, and that process can be a helpful way. I think unfortunately there's not a ton of clinical resources out there at this point. It is growing and there are more, but there are not many. But I also provide trainings and consultation directly to therapists, so folks can reach out to me as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We have a couple of questions. Let's see. Monique, great question, has a specific question. What would you all say is your approach when working with survivors that are presenting? These are two, I think, very different answers, that are presenting with DID and those who are presenting with bipolar.
So I use the mid with all of my clients. That helps me to assess kind of the levels of dissociation, which kind of I love as kind of a clinical indicator of where kind of on that continuum. We want to think about bipolar and DID as part of this trauma continuum. And so if we think about it that way, we can kind of like, where are they on this spectrum? Because a lot of times they may not know their DID, and then we do it like things come out, or we miss the levels of dissociation and how there could be symptom overlap between borderline, BPD, and DID. And so when we assess and we look at kind of where they're at with symptomology, not as terms of a label, but how much is dissociation showing up? How much is some of these problematic behaviors? I like to look at it that way, not so much as do they fit this label, but what are the symptoms kind of clusters? And I treat it with the same approach of safety and stabilization using EMDR and IFS. Now, how fast we can get there is going to be impacted by the level of trauma and individual factors for each client. But yeah, that's kind of where I start, is finding where they are on that continuum and then providing education to the client on the continuum.
Thank you. Elizabeth, this question is for you as well. But Connor was saying that he appreciated your mentioning the reconceptualizing care. And the part of the social work code of ethics speaks to practicing within your competency. He said that he believes that competency encompasses burnout and respecting our boundaries. And in order to competently respond to clients and address their needs holistically, he's wondering if you can speak to that a little bit more. For example, what does that, like you talked about like a network of care, right? So for example, clinician tackling microcare and then case manager tackling more macro obstacles such as housing, food. What does that look like?
Yeah, I think that's where the coordinating care helps you to stay in your lane as a clinician without getting overextended, because that's where things can get really fuzzy. And that just came through learning and kind of being in residential and going, oh, this is pulling on my license in a way that's outside of how do I navigate these? And so now having this coordination of care and talking with the advocate, or if you're in residential, this is why this is my lane. This is why I'm going to do handoffs to these things. So they know if this comes up in case management, communicate this with me. If this comes up in counseling, I'm going to then go, can I communicate that? Or would you like to communicate this to your case manager? So that way we don't burn out. We don't try to do it all. And it helps us keep our roles more defined, but allows us to be able to then better, more holistically address the needs of the client. So that's how I've kind of conceptualized. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and I think I've seen this in practice done really well as we've evaluated like residential care. And I remember like one specific site visit that we did where when we were evaluating that, you know, the food was like they had a whole kitchen that was very accessible, a lot of food available, lots of snacks, and knowing that like that survivors often have complicated relationships with food, and that those like there are certain behaviors that sometimes present because of that relationship. So knowing that like I'd seen very different ways that like non-trauma informed ways that certain residential programs had approached like those behaviors and trying to deter them as opposed to like really working through them. And I remember going to this program and asking them like kind of, you know, knowing that you have this very readily available, it's available at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's available all the time. Like, how do you approach like that complicated relationship? And they're like, well, if our staff, you know, if our daytime staff notices or our nighttime staff notices that the survivor is like having this type of behavior or that this seems to be, you know, not serving them well, like we talk about that in our meeting with their therapist is present when we have these meetings once a week. And it's something that the therapist can ask if the survivor wants to like address that, or how is that like showing up? Is there something that maybe came up? And there's a lot of clarity in knowing that like they know that these conversations are going to be happening. And it allows for like a really cohesive treatment and for therapy to affect the daily life in a really beautiful way.
Mm-hmm.
If you feel like there's one thing you wish that you want our attendees to take away from this webinar, now would be definitely the time to add that.
I did send a resource out to you yesterday to be shared. And why I think it's so important is we often miss the developmental aspects and the gaps. So I took Erik Erikson's stages of development and put it in kind of a way that we could start to conceptualize how do we support adult clients to address these gaps? Because what I'm finding is a lot of times in residential or an outpatient, we're missing some of these things that are causing friction in everyday life that cause relational tensions or difficulties at work. And it's because these developmental needs have not been met. And we've got to be able to think through how do we conceptualize building these developmental stages, but do it in a way that's appropriate for adults. And so one of the books that really helped me with conceptualizing it is Healing Developmental Trauma. It's the NARM, Neuroaffective Relational Model. And so that got me thinking through kind of how people develop and grow. And so I wanted to share that handout as just a way of how is my client showing up in ways that aren't congruent with someone in a healthy developmental state at that age? And then how do I help thinking about the client? Are there goals that they have or areas this is creating difficulty in their life because they're not developmentally appropriate to health and functioning well? So I wanted to share that just as a resource for clinicians. It's starting to help address some of the developmental pieces that often need to be taken care of to help them thrive.
Yeah, thank you.
I think if anyone is interested in becoming a therapist in this space and they're not already, something that's really important is having connections with other professionals in the field. And a great way to do that can be like what Elizabeth was sharing about going to conferences or hopping on webinars, but also you can reach directly out to me and I can connect you with folks. There are clinical consultation groups out there that exist that are free to hop on over Zoom. There are different groups of support, and really having others who can collaborate with you, who can support you, even if you're not directly, discussing client information, just having other folks who are like, hey, I've been somewhere similar to where you are, and this work can be extremely heavy and hard, and I'm in that with you, can be so beneficial.
Yeah.
I think what keeps coming to me since I came from working with the victim services route versus starting at a clinician is you're all here because you know about trafficking and being willing to talk about that more. I'm always surprised at the amount of education that still needs to happen. And as I went to school, just seeing that and even seeing it in supervision with professors and things like that, that really weren't understanding or identifying cases that were coming in where I'm thinking, man, this sounds like a trafficking victim. Like they don't have the language for it and they don't know. I think also, I've ran into it feels like there's a lot of clinicians working in betrayal trauma. And I keep running into these circles and being aware that they need training as well on what trafficking is and who is the person on the other side of that betrayal trauma, and they almost make them the villain. And so I've had a lot of conversations and a lot of education in those groups. So we're expanding out not just within our particular area of like being trafficking, working with trafficking survivors, but also thinking like there's so many clinicians and there's so many other people that are working with victims and with survivors that we need to keep talking about that. And that's what helps educate them and then see, because without a doubt, there's other therapists they don't know it. And if the client doesn't identify with it, they're sitting with them. And I think as either Emily or Elizabeth, one of you said today, we can cause more harm sometimes, or we've heard that we cause more harm. And I know none of us are doing this to cause more harm. So that's part of our responsibility with the education. But everybody here can help, whether a clinician or not, by taking the time to talk to clinicians, to talk to therapy groups, to be out there and educate, to go into some of these table consult groups and train clinicians on what trafficking looks like so they can see that better.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you all, being here and being part of starting that conversation and giving people a place to look. And in that vein, I see a lot of hunger in the chat of people wanting these resources. And I love that hunger. This is a great question. And I think a great way for us to end today. Kelly's asking, and I know you all have some experience with residential, whether it's lateral experience with working with youth who've been in residential or working at residential. What do you want non-clinicians working in this space, in safe homes or emergency care or victim services, to know?
I think a lot of kind of what we talked about today, just about cultural competence, understanding trauma to some extent, is so helpful, but also knowing that it's not your job to do that therapeutic work. And sometimes it can feel really heavy and confusing in those moments when it's like, oh, okay, this person just shared something with me. I don't know if I'm equipped to deal with this. I'm not sure how to respond. But responding with compassion and care and kindness, you can do that, I hope. Yeah, I'm sure you can. And then possibly, letting that person know or yourself to say like, hey, this might actually be something that could really help to talk more about with your therapist. And just letting them know that if you're in those situations.
Yeah. I would add seeing each other as an essential teammate. You can't do the work without one another. And I think when you look at it that way, everybody has their role, and it's, it could be easy as the therapist. I know working in residential, they're getting to do all the fun things with the advocate or the staff. And I have a very different role. And if I'm not aware, like that can be a place of like, well, I want to have that type of bond or connection with my client, but my role is different. And in order to protect the work, I have to have a different way of relating. But that doesn't make me less valuable or less important to the client and their healing. It looks different. And because the staff is doing this fun part or gets to like, doesn't mean now they understand everything about the client or understand all the things about trauma. Like you have to have both together. And when you work and respect each other's roles and understand kind of how those fit, by doing the education work and understanding one another. I think that's when it can be really beautiful. When that doesn't happen, that creates, I think, damage to the client, and it can lend room for harm to happen, and burnout on the team.
Additionally, I think keeping in mind just the stages of change that realizing that it's not linear, that it's not going to be a linear journey as they heal. And that leads to having a lot of patience and not make any predetermined ideas that, well, they're back in this position again, or they're back, like it's a healing journey for them. And so that patience is such a key piece for all of us.
Yeah, we love stages of change. So thank you all for being here and for sharing all of your resources and your expertise. I'm really excited about how this webinar went and the information that you shared, and you're all just filling such an essential gap. And so we appreciate the work that you do in being there in the capacity that you are, and the advocacy that you do outside of your clinical care to survivors, because I know you each do that as well. So I appreciate that, and I hope that everyone has an enjoyable Friday and a good rest of your weekend.
Thank you.